single mother with a big heart.
If you needed anything, she was always there.
She was a sweet girl. Everybody loved her.
Is the victim of a bizarre murder.
Duct tape had been wrapped around her head about 14 times.
This is nothing I had ever seen before or even heard of before.
Leaving her young son as the only witness.
A 4-year-old child had been just mere feet away, his mother being killed.
Investigators focus on the men in her life.
This guy, he wouldn't look at us. He was more nervous than normal.
And that polygraph test, he passed. It was frustrating as hell.
She was using Norma's house for these sexual liaisons.
To unveil a killer hiding in plain sight.
Of everyone we dealt with, he was maybe the coolest customer of the bunch.
People didn't see that inner demon. He was an unexpected killer.
It just blows you away.
Port Hueneme, California, a peaceful beach town on the Pacific coast.
It's a hidden gem. Port Hueneme is about 60 miles north of LA. It's a completely different environment. It's a lot more relaxed.
It's a quiet town, and it's a town that has, for a long time, a ridiculously low crime rate and very rarely a homicide.
But the tranquility of the seaside community is shattered one summer morning when police get an urgent call.
On June 1st, 1993, it was about 7 o'clock in the morning, our dispatch received a call of a possible homicide.
An ex-husband had called up and said that his ex-wife had been murdered.
We hadn't had a homicide in over 3 years. It took me a second to realize, okay, this is real.
Detectives arrive to begin the investigation, but nothing can prepare them for the scene inside.
I got inside the house, and then it was like, oh my God. This is just too bizarre for words. She's laying on the floor, head encased in duct tape. It had been partially cut away, but it appeared as though someone had tried to wrap her like a mummy.
It went from the top of her forehead to the chin.
It was just incredibly strange. This is nothing I had ever seen before or even heard of before.
And some rigor mortis had set in the back portion of her body because she was laying on the back. Usually rigor mortis takes a number of hours to show up. We estimated that the victim probably died in the early morning hours. When I saw that duct tape, the first thing that entered my mind was this was somebody she knew. Whoever did it didn't want to have her look at them while they were committing the crime.
Looking to unravel the mystery of this bizarre murder, detectives turn to the victim's ex-husband, who claims to have discovered the body.
At the house, the ex-husband was there, his brother was there, and 2 younger sons were there.
The ex-husband, Tony, identifies the victim as 32-year-old Norma Rodriguez, mother to 2 boys, Andrew, 11 years old, and Austin, 4 years old.
Tony, he said that he had come over to the house to pick up the kids to take them to school, which was his regular practice.
The 2 boys were still asleep in their beds. When Tony realized what had happened to their mother, he told them to stay in their room until police arrived.
Tony, his brother Hector, and the 2 sons were transported to the Port Hueneme Police Department, where they were going to be interviewed separately. Tony and Hector were first at the house, and we needed to determine what happened.
Police continue to comb through the house looking for clues.
It was not a scene of extreme violence. There wasn't blood anywhere. There weren't a lot of things overturned.
In the bedroom, we located her purse, and it was intact. There wasn't anything that seemed to be missing.
This was not like a burglary that had gone wrong.
There's no sign of forced entry into the home. Then, something else catches the detective's eye.
I noticed a set of keys that were on the floor. They were in an unusual location, close to her body. We checked and confirmed they were Norma's house keys.
But why were Norma's keys lying next to her body? As investigators finish processing the scene, Norma's sister, Auralia, arrives.
I was supposed to pick her up because we were going to go looking for a car for her. And I had been calling her. And I drove to her house. That's when I saw the yellow tape. I saw the police department there, and that's what they told me would happen. And my worst nightmares, did I ever think that this would happen to my sister? It is horrible, horrible.
Norma Rodriguez was born and raised in rural Texas.
We're 7 sisters and 1 brother. She was the middle child, and, I was really close to Norma. She was very quiet, very reserved, a very big heart. If you needed anything, she was always there.
I first met Norma in 1975 in junior high school. We were 14 years old, and we became friends right away. Well, we used to hang out together and just go everywhere together. She could be feisty, but she was a sweet girl. Everybody loved her.
After high school, Norma moved to Oxnard, California for college and soon fell for another student named Tony.
She loved him. She just loved being with him.
Their college romance became more serious, and 2 years later in 1982, Tony popped the question. They soon had their first son, Andrew, and their second son, Austin, arrived 7 years later.
She was just a great mom. Norma was very devoted to her boys. Her boys were her life.
But in 1991, after almost 10 years together, Tony and Norma's marriage became strained.
Tony was really never around.
She was getting into arguments and fights with Tony, asking him to provide for them. She realized it would be an easier life for her if she just went on her own without Tony. And that's what she did.
Later that year, Norma moved with her sons to the neighboring town of Port Hueneme. She got a job at a local retail store and started a new chapter in her life.
Being a single mom, people might think that's a hard job. She enjoyed it. And it was hard for her, but she was happy.
Who would want to take the life of this loving mother, and in such a bizarre way? Later that day, at police headquarters, detectives began to interview Norma's ex-husband, Tony Rodriguez, and his brother, Hector.
As the first 2 parties to the scene, the investigators had to look at them.
The detectives asked Tony about how he found Norma earlier that day.
Tony, he said that he had knocked on the door, but Norma didn't answer. Sons, Andrew and Austin, were asleep. The door was locked, so then he used a credit card in order to slip the lock, and he was able to open the front door.
When Tony and Hector entered the living room, they saw Norma lying on the floor, her face wrapped in duct tape.
Hector told us that he cut the tape because they didn't know whether she was deceased or not, and they wanted to try to make it easier for her to breathe. He's the one that had the scissors in his possession, and he's the one that decided to cut the tape off of her face.
We thought, wow, that's a little strange. Why is this guy doing this? Why is he messing up our evidence? Hector told us that the body was still somewhat warm. And that didn't make sense because by that time she had full rigor mortis. I mean, she had obviously been deceased for a number of hours. I just wasn't buying it.
Investigators are skeptical. Is Hector misleading police because the 2 men have something to hide? They hone in on Tony and Hector as possible suspects.
We don't know these people. We don't know what they're capable of.
Tony and Hector are suspicious. And Tony, being Norma's ex, he was right at the top of our list.
Coming up, detectives broaden their hunt for a possible killer.
We've got countless potential witnesses, countless potential suspects, interviews with co-workers.
We didn't know who it was. I just wanted him off the streets.
Investigators suspect a love interest from Norma's past has something to hide.
It was a brief but intense relationship.
It was that selfishness, that narcissistic quality that would cause him to end someone else's life.
And what police uncover shocks everyone.
All this time, were we dealing with a true sociopath and, couldn't see it?
Mother of two, Norma Rodriguez, has been found murdered with her head wrapped in duct tape. Less than 24 hours into the investigation, detectives are interviewing their first suspect, starting with her ex-husband, Tony Rodriguez.
In a case like this, statistics will show you that an overwhelming amount of the time, it's going to be that significant other or former significant other who ends up being your suspect.
Investigators ask Tony about his relationship with Norma in the weeks leading up to her death.
At the time, Tony said that they had been separated for a couple of years. I don't believe they had filed for divorce yet, but they were living separately, and Tony had visitation rights. They weren't close friends anymore, but they tried to maintain the friendship for the boys.
But police have a different account from Norma's family.
We learned that shortly before the homicide, there were some conflicts.
Norma, she was upset at the fact that he would come make excuses to come over with the boys, but he would end up wanting to stay there. She used to complain about that. I said, don't let him in. He doesn't have the right to come into your house. And she was a little timid when it came down to Tony.
According to loved ones, Tony couldn't accept that Norma was moving on. Detectives press him about his whereabouts in the hours surrounding Norma's murder.
Tony said that on May the 30th, early afternoon, he talked with Norma and asked if our son Andrew could stay with him. Tony had tickets to an Angels game the next day, and so they agreed that that was okay.
Tony says Andrew was dropped back home the next night. At the time, Tony never entered the house. He found Norma's body the next day. Did Norma's ex innocently walk into the crime scene that morning, or had something more sinister happened?
The potential motive with him was he wanted the kids. Maybe one thing led to another, and he lost control.
In a room nearby, police questioned Tony's brother Hector, since he was with him when Norma's body was found. They asked where he and Tony went after dropping Norma's son at his mom's.
Hector, he said that they had been at his residence with other family members in the city of Oxnard. And when we interviewed those family members, they corroborated what Tony and Hector told us.
Knowing their alibis are far from concrete, detectives asked Tony and Hector to take polygraph tests.
The results of the tests were that they were being honest in stating that they did not know anything about the homicide.
With no hard evidence to hold them, investigators are forced to let the two men go. News of Norma's death quickly spreads through the small community.
When I found out about her being murdered like that, I had told my cousin that I had just talked to her. It can't be true because I just talked to her. It was true.
At the police station, detectives received the results of the autopsy.
The cause of death was established as manual strangulation. Norma wasn't a tiny woman. Whoever did this had to possess significant upper body strength.
Some important details emerge about the duct tape.
The length of it was approximately 20 feet and had been wrapped around her head about 14 times.
The duct tape was examined and there were skin cells that were discovered. But in 1993, DNA technology was in its infancy. You had to have a fairly significant sample size in order to potentially get a result from it. In Norma's case, they didn't have nearly enough in these samples.
To find out who did this, we have to dig deeper.
Searching for new leads, detectives hope Norma's 11-year-old son, Andrew, can help. With Tony's consent, the detectives talk with him at the station.
When you're interviewing any type of a witness, it's a difficult process. And you have to understand that when you're interviewing a child, is extremely difficult. We interviewed Andrew, and we just wanted to try to get as much information as we could. From the date of the homicide, Andrew had gone to a baseball game with his father and his uncle. Later at night, Andrew was dropped off at the house, and the house was dark.
Andrew walked up to the front door, found it was locked. He went around to his bedroom, saw that the window was open, and crawled in.
Then, Andrew shares a disturbing detail told to him by his younger brother.
When Andrew came into the bedroom, 4-year-old Austin had said, "Mommy has a Band-Aid on her face." That didn't register immediately with Andrew, and so he went to bed. And it wasn't until morning that Andrew found out exactly what Austin meant by a Band-Aid. It just ripped at your heart knowing that a 4-year-old child had been just mere feet away from his mother being killed. And at one point he had come out, he had seen his mother's body. That just ripped at me a lot.
What else had Norma's youngest son, Austin, seen? Detectives decide to speak to the 4-year-old.
At first he was withdrawn. He really didn't want to talk about it, which was understandable. I knew that because he's 4 years old, and I couldn't have gone on much longer than I did. And I knew that I needed to stop. But then he mentioned a man by the name of Corey.
He brought up the name Corey as someone who was over at the house at that time. Now we've got this person who might end up being our prime suspect.
But who was Corey? Had he killed Norma? Did the single mom's youngest son just solve her murder?
We've got to run it down as far as it goes.
Police are investigating the bizarre murder of single mother Norma Rodriguez. Her youngest son, Austin, says he saw a man named Corey at their home around the time of the murder.
At that time, we had no idea who Corey was, but it was something that had to be checked out.
Detectives learn from the family that Corey could be Corey Davis, one of Norma's co-workers. So they head to her workplace.
First step was find out, to what extent Corey knew Norma, if they socialized, if they were friends away from work, and so forth.
Corey was more nervous than normal. In talking with him, he wouldn't look at us. He kept staring down, not tuning in or paying attention.
Corey's unusual behavior during their conversation alarms investigators.
He did not like being talked to and having to answer anything.
They question Corey about his relationship with Norma.
He stated that he would interact with Norma at work, but they weren't that close with each other, and they didn't have any interactions beyond that.
Detectives want to know if he was at Norma's house near the time of her murder, as young Austin claimed.
He made it pretty clear that he wasn't at the house at that time. Instead, he said the night of the homicide he was at home. The only people who were there at home with him were his parents. We needed to find out how much of what he was telling us was, provably true.
While officers are sent to check Corey's alibi, detectives speak to Norma's other coworkers, starting with her friend, Beatrice.
Beatrice came to Norma's house on Sunday, the day before the homicide. Norma had a get-together, a small barbecue at her house for several of her co-workers.
Police ask Beatrice if she remembers anything unusual about the day of the barbecue.
Beatrice said that while she was there, suddenly Norma can't find her keys anymore. And they ended up searching all over Norma's house, trying to figure out what happened to Norma's keys.
They didn't find them, and then they're laying beside her body, beside her house at the time she's found. We figured someone had taken her keys, and that's how they were able to enter the house.
It's a significant lead. Does this mean the killer stole the keys at Norma's barbecue? Detectives renew their focus on her inner circle.
From everything we knew, this was a pretty personal crime. We had a certain confidence that the killer knew Norma.
At the police station, investigators discover information they received from Corey Davis has some holes.
One of the things we do with everyone is we find out what their addresses are, their date of birth, everything else. And with Corey Davis, one of the things we noticed was that his address he gave us was not the address where he was actually living. So there was a discrepancy there.
Why would Corey withhold that information from detectives? They wonder what else he's hiding.
But at this point in time, Corey jumped out at us as this is the one we need to concentrate on.
Police bring Corey in for an interview, but he's far from helpful.
He's like, well, I don't want to be involved in this. Well, I understand that, but like it or not, you are part of this case. If you want to be eliminated from the suspect pool, the best way to do that is to cooperate with us.
Detectives share details of the crime with Corey to observe his reaction.
With the information that we were giving to him, he was obviously upset and he took it really hard.
Corey denies any involvement in Norma's death. They ask him to take a polygraph test.
He submitted to the test and he passed.
All detectives have tying Corey to the crime scene is a statement from Norma's 4-year-old son. But police know he could be mistaken, given his young age and traumatic experience.
At that point, Corey worked his way down the ladder of possible suspects dramatically.
1 week into the investigation, detectives are out of leads. They look at who else was at Norma's barbecue the day before she was killed. Friends tell them about a former coworker named Warren Mackey.
Warren Mackey was a previous co-worker of Norma's, and also he lived in fairly close proximity to her.
Warren and Norma hit it off and became friends.
They worked together for a while, and the work relationship became a social relationship. And it appeared that Warren had something more than just a friendship interest in Norma.
I remember Norma telling me that there was a guy there that she used to work with, and he was always trying to talk to her and trying to ask her out.
Talking to Norma's coworkers, detectives learned that Warren pursued Norma, but she wasn't interested in him romantically.
Norma told Beatrice and some of the other people that she felt that Warren wanted more than to be friends and that she wasn't interested in that. She tried to curtail any attempts that he may have made to ask her out. Some of the employees that we talked with felt that Warren wasn't real pleased with that. He liked Norma and that he wanted the relationship a little bit more than what it was.
But Norma still tried to maintain their friendship.
She noticed he was kind of like an outcast, just very private. So she tried to include him in the group. She didn't want to leave him out.
As detectives look closer at the quiet coworker, the information they uncover is concerning.
Started picking up little details about him at that point. There were some people who said, yeah, good guy, he was okay to work with. But, there were enough people who pointed out that he was a little weird and had made some overtures to Norma enough to make us want to look into this a little further.
But did Warren's workplace crush make him a killer?
The nature of the relationship was of interest to us. We're going to have a conversation with Warren Mackey.
Police investigating the murder of single mother Norma Rodriguez are questioning her former coworker, Warren Mackey. Detectives have learned that Warren may have been more than a doting colleague. They're trying to determine if he's connected to this brutal crime.
In our first encounter with Warren Mackey, there was nothing that seemed overtly suspicious or evasive or anything about him.
Detectives ask Warren about his feelings for Norma.
The impression that Warren Mackey gave us was that, his relationship with Norma Rodriguez was pretty casual. They didn't see quite as much of each other because they were no longer working with each other, but they socialized a lot.
Warren said that they were close, but it was only a close friendship. He never had romantic feelings for Norma.
He had tried to present himself to Norma as someone to lean on, someone to talk to. I'm here for you.
But investigators aren't fully buying it.
We felt that Warren liked Norma and that he wanted to make the relationship closer than it already was.
Then, Warren reveals a detail that grabs investigators' attention.
He had helped out Norma with, a couple little things around the house. And one of the things that he mentioned was that the kids had a small basketball hoop and it had somehow gotten broken and that he had fixed it. And what really kind of set off an alarm was the fact that he had fixed it with duct tape.
This is the first time in the investigation that anybody's mentioned duct tape or someone possessing duct tape.
Detectives drilled down on when Warren last saw Norma.
Warren said that he had been in the presence of Norma at the barbecue the day before the homicide. By the time things had wrapped up for the evening, it was essentially just him and Norma there, and they had just kicked back and watched TV for a while. This made him one of the last people who could have or would have seen Norma alive.
Had the former coworker made advances on Norma, then attacked her when she turned him down? Detectives ask where Warren was on the night of the murder.
Warren said that on May the 31st, close to Norma's homicide, he and his roommate and his roommate's girlfriend, they went to a nightclub in Santa Barbara till about 1:30, and then they came back to where they were living at in Oxnard. They talked for a short while, and then everybody went to bed. We drove to Oxnard, and we ended up talking with his roommate and her girlfriend who had gone with him for the night, and they corroborated his story as far as them going to Santa Barbara, closing the nightclub, and then getting back probably between 1:30 and 2 in the morning.
Could Warren have had time to drive to Port Hueneme and kill Norma after arriving home from a late night out with friends? Warren agrees to take a polygraph.
And he passed it, stating that he knew nothing about the homicide and he knew no one who would have killed her.
With nothing concrete tying him to the crime, police let Warren go. But before he leaves, Warren remembers Norma had problems with a man she was dating almost a year ago, named Daniel Garcia.
As the investigation continued, we started interviewing a number of people about Daniel. We found out that Daniel Garcia was Norma's boyfriend for a short period of time.
They met at a party. Norma had a strong attraction to the charming mechanic.
It was a brief but intense relationship, lasted a few months.
She told me about Daniel, that she really cared about him a lot. They would do fun things together, and she always had a good time with him.
Friends tell police Daniel ended the relationship, blindsiding Norma.
Daniel had approached Norma and essentially told her that he wanted to go back with a former girlfriend. But Norma was affected quite a bit by the breakup.
Then, detectives learned that the relationship was turbulent.
There was some fraying in the relationship, and there were some conflicts. Now, that sends up some big red flags. There was one coworker who mentioned that they had witnessed a fairly heated argument between Norma and Daniel.
Daniel came in while she was working. For whatever reason it started, they had a verbal altercation that were witnessed by other people. It shows there was hostile feelings on the part of Daniel Garcia.
When detectives dig deeper into Daniel and Norma's relationship, they learn he visited Norma at home about 2 weeks before her murder.
Norma confided to her close friend she was involved with him before her death.
With a history of conflict in the relationship, did an argument turn deadly?
And this is big. Any big fight that went on, that was problematic.
Detectives are closing in on their new suspect.
This could be our guy. We have to find out if he could have committed this crime.
The investigation into the murder of single mother Norma Rodriguez is heating up. Police have a new suspect in their sights, an ex-boyfriend, Daniel Garcia.
One of the things that we learned about the relationship between Daniel and Norma was that there were some conflicts. That sends up some red flags.
Daniel agrees to come to the police station for questioning.
Norma really had no confrontations. She was very mild-mannered. The fact that she was getting into verbal altercations was unusual.
When detectives ask Daniel about his relationship with Norma, he denies any problems.
Daniel said that he wanted to go back with a former girlfriend. And so they broke up and went their separate ways. But they were still able to be somewhat friends, and he would stop by on occasion.
Detectives confront him about the heated argument with Norma at her workplace almost a year earlier.
At the time, Norma learned that he had had other relationships, and it was a problem. She was pretty upset by that.
She still had feelings for Daniel.
Had Norma attempted to restart their relationship, but instead wound up in a fight that spiraled out of control.
During his interview, Daniel told us that he saw Norma but didn't have an argument.
Detectives asked Daniel where he was the night Norma was killed.
He stated that he was at home with other family members watching TV, and then he went to bed. We talked with other family members, and that alibi was corroborated. But family members will lie for other family members. Sometimes they won't be perfectly honest with what they know, and it's extremely difficult to put weight on that.
Like previous suspects, Daniel is subjected to a polygraph.
And he passed.
With no evidence connecting the ex-lover to the crime, police let him go. It's another disappointing dead end.
After a couple of weeks of going through this, talking to countless potential witnesses, countless potential suspects, neighborhood canvasses, interviews with co-workers, polygraph examinations, it was frustrating as hell.
That was really, really hard on my family. We did not have an answer to who killed Norma. I just wanted not only justice for Norma, I was very concerned for any woman out there. We didn't know who it was. It could be someone that just passed me by. I didn't know. I just wanted him off the streets.
1 month into the investigation, the pressure continues to mount on police to solve the case.
We would get calls from the media every day. Every place we went in the community, they would ask us what was going on, and it was a lot of pressure.
Then, a surprising development. Norma's family contacts police with new information about Beatrice, Norma's coworker and friend.
It turns out that Beatrice was having an affair, and she was using Norma's house as a location for these sexual liaisons. Norma knew about it and in fact condoned it and gave her a copy of her house key.
But why hadn't Beatrice disclosed this detail to police earlier?
We confronted Beatrice with this information. Initially, huge wave of embarrassment. But she laid it out on the line. She told us, the when, the how many times.
Detectives question whether the secret rendezvous led to Norma's murder.
Now we've got other people who had, either continued access to the house. Previously, they were on the periphery of this case. Now they've moved right to the center of it.
One person detectives immediately turn to is Beatrice's husband, who also knew Norma. Had he gone after Norma for helping his wife have a secret affair?
And now, suddenly, Beatrice's husband, he's potentially in the suspect pool. We have to find out if he has an alibi and if we can corroborate it.
He apparently didn't know his wife was having an extramarital affair in Norma's house.
That was not the most comfortable thing to do from an investigative standpoint, but it still had to be done. And, the guy was crushed. He was absolutely crushed.
Detectives question Beatrice's husband about his whereabouts on the night of Norma's murder.
He told us that he had been at work late that evening. We talked to a lot of his coworkers. Everything about this man was genuine.
6 months into the investigation of the murder of Norma Rodriguez, detectives worry the trail has gone cold.
We're no closer to narrowing it down than we were on day one.
This case was very mind-boggling. You build up things that, wow, this is going to be great, it's coming together, and then it falls apart. As time progressed, the leads started falling off. It was tough. It was really tough.
Months turn to years. For nearly a decade, the case is at a standstill. But Norma's family doesn't give up.
Every year, we'll call the police department for any updates, any new leads or anything. We kept it active. We didn't want this case forgotten.
During this entire investigation, I had the picture of Norma Rodriguez on my desk. I swore to her that I would never give up trying to find out who was responsible.
Then, 10 years to the day Norma was killed. An astonishing break in the case.
Worker with a crime lab, he had a lot of the evidence that we secured in the Norma homicide. He called me and he says, we have a match. We have a match on the DNA.
My head just exploded with 1,000 thoughts. It was just nuts.
I remember receiving the phone call and it was like winning the lottery.
It's been 10 years since 32-year-old Norma Rodriguez was found in her home, strangled and wrapped in duct tape. The case has remained unsolved, with all leads turning out to be dead ends, until now. With advancements in DNA technology, evidence collected a decade ago has finally yielded results.
At the time of the autopsy of Norma Rodriguez, there were a number of samples that were taken. Hair samples, blood samples, and fingernail clippings.
The crime lab said we have a match on the DNA, and it comes back to Warren Mackey.
Warren, Norma's friend and former coworker who had previously passed a polygraph and had an alibi for the night of the murder. At the time of the investigation, Warren had submitted his DNA and was cooperative.
Of everyone we dealt with, he was maybe the coolest customer of the bunch. It just blows you away.
Investigators start putting the pieces together about Warren Mackey.
If you're dealing with someone who's a true sociopath, they can get past the polygraph test. So now I'm thinking, all this time, were we dealing with a true sociopath and, couldn't see it?
We just went into high gear. We started unraveling everything again and doing what we needed to do.
Detectives start building a case based on forensics.
They evaluated DNA that we had gotten off of Norma's body, and we found Warren's DNA under Norma's fingernails.
The DNA evidence is a major breakthrough, but to build an airtight case, they want more.
The single biggest piece of physical evidence we had at the time was the duct tape. So it got sent off and it got tested.
The DNA that was obtained within the multiple layers of the duct tape was returned to Warren Mackey.
The odds of the DNA match being from someone else besides Warren Mackey was 1 in 810 billion. So we felt pretty confident that this was our person.
Investigators pieced together the events that led up to Norma's murder.
I think this was the classic case of a jilted suitor. And my guess is that he just got a flat-out rejection. He built up his expectations to a point where he couldn't take the fall.
Investigators believe in the early hours of May 31st, Warren Mackey entered Norma's home using keys he had stolen from her purse at the barbecue the day before.
According to Norma's son Andrew, the house was dark. Many times she would fall asleep watching TV. Maybe she fell asleep on the couch. She had no idea what was about to happen.
Detectives believe that's when Warren strangled Norma.
In his mind, she needed to die because she shouldn't have rejected him.
Then Warren wrapped her head in duct tape.
Trying to depersonalize the scene and covered her face so that he wouldn't see it.
And he ripped that duct tape, handling both ends of the duct tape, wrapped it completely around her face, and left.
Police also believe Norma's 4-year-old son, Austin, was in the next room, not realizing his mother had been murdered.
Austin didn't process, because he was a very small child, that he was too young to process what had happened. An absolute nightmare.
After Warren kills Norma, he returns to his place in nearby Oxnard, as if nothing happened.
I believe that Warren Mackey was the type of person who felt that if I can't have her, nobody can. I think this was one sick individual who had no value for life. He had no right to do what he did.
On August 28, 2003, Ventura County investigators arrest Warren Mackey for the first-degree murder of Norma Rodriguez. Warren pleads not guilty.
During the subsequent 10 years, Warren had settled down. He had gotten married, had a job, was living a very stable life. His friends, neighbors said that he was a nice, caring man.
And for him to live 10 years after that and not even have any remorse, that is not human. I can't imagine what is in a person's head to even hurt another human in that way.
Then, on January 10, 2005, as investigators prepare for trial, the DA receives an unexpected call. Warren Mackey has changed his plea to guilty.
Warren Mackey is an unexpected killer because people didn't see that inner demon, that selfishness, that narcissistic quality that would cause him to end someone else's life. People just didn't see him that way, but he was that way, and he is that way.
On March 28, 2005, Warren Mackey is sentenced to 15 years to life for the murder of Norma Rodriguez.
Oh, it was phenomenal. It was such an elation. You felt like this weight being lifted.
At the end of the day, we achieved closure for the family, but there's never going to be complete closure.
The devastating loss of the vibrant single mother will forever be felt by her loved ones.
I think about Norma a lot. She was having a good life, and he took it away from her.
It still hurts like it happened yesterday. I miss her in my life. That wound does not heal. We just put it in the back burner. We have to live for Norma, and we have to go forward.
A trailblazing local businesswoman, beloved by her community.
She was effervescent. She just had a glamour about her that was just unique.
She took pride in who she was.
Savagely murdered in her own home.
This person was so enraged that they just kept stabbing and kept stabbing and kept stabbing.
She had been hit in the head to the point that it actually had changed shape. We're looking for something that's got an edge on it, but that can snap bones.
Detectives uncover a trail of secrets and lies.
He couldn't explain things, and he failed the polygraph miserably.
What kind of animal is this person?
And chase a killer that stays one step ahead of them.
They fled to another country.
Until a series of stunning revelations leaves an entire town in shock.
Everyone was a suspect, and everyone was afraid.
Here comes some guy out of the blue telling us that he's the one who committed the murder.
You would think there's just a serial killer or somebody crazy running around.
I was like, how could we have gotten this wrong?
Two hours southwest of Louisville, Kentucky, lies the quiet town of Madisonville.
Madisonville, Kentucky is a small community. It's built on coal mines and agriculture.
It's a close, tight-knit community.
There's not a lot of crime in our area.
They call themselves the best town on earth, and for the most part, they truly believe that.
On January 13th, 2003, Madisonville police receive a call from an elderly man for a wellness check on his 85-year-old fiancée, Anna Mae Branson.
Her fiance, Dr. Bob Fenneman, was afraid that she may have fallen or that she had had a stroke of some type.
He knocked on the door and couldn't get her to answer, and that's when he became worried. And he called Anna Mae's brother and the local police department.
An officer meets Anne's fiancé and brother outside her house. Finding a backup key under a bush, they enter the home to look for her.
The patrol officer went in one direction. Dr. Bob Fenneman was looking around, and Earl Winstead, her brother, went down to the basement. When he got to the bottom of the basement steps, he said, "I found her." It appeared at first though she could have fallen, but then upon seeing all the injuries to her body, it was obvious that Miss Branson had been murdered.
Homicide investigators are called to the scene and are shocked when they arrive.
Miss Ann was a friend of my mother's, and it was quite devastating. She was on her stomach. Her legs were extended. She had many, many stab wounds to her back.
She had been hit in the head to the point that it actually had changed shape.
Looking at the body, detectives start building a theory of what happened.
She had defensive wounds on her forearms. Then she was knocked down. That's when the perpetrator really went to work.
Her head was facing the small chest type freezer. There was actually two types of blood spatter on the freezer next to her head. One was like a striking motion, and one was a golf type swing where the spin off from the blood spatter actually landed on that.
I can remember thinking that the perpetrator must have used two different weapons. The weapon was not only going through flesh and organs, going through bones, and was coming out on the floor underneath her. It was unlike anything that we'd ever seen or heard of before.
Why was this defenseless woman attacked so viciously? Detectives continue their search for evidence.
At the time, we didn't see anything stolen.
All of her large carat jewelry were on her finger and had not been touched.
The amount of damage she sustained suggests that the attacker was emotionally attached to her.
You think about someone leaving the area, dripping blood from, their arms, and not to find any blood on the door frames, handrails. It was surmisable that person had taken the time to clean up the crime scene.
But other than the evidence on the freezer and the amount of damage that she had sustained, there was no other real clues.
News of Anne's death spreads quickly in the small town.
I got the call that Anne had been murdered. And not just murdered, but unbelievably, brutally murdered. It's just something that you see on the news, but it's not real until it happens in your family.
I just felt like a ton of bricks had fallen on me. Having someone who was a second mother to me killed in such a horrible way is just overwhelmingly devastating.
Anna Mae Winstead was born in Madisonville on November 30th, 1917. And from the beginning, she stood out from the crowd.
Anne was effervescent. She just had a confidence about her, a glamour about her that was just unique.
Anna Mae was a very flamboyant lady. She had a zest for life.
In 1935, Ann married her high school sweetheart, Carol Branson.
When Anna Mae and Carol were first married, they were poor. During World War II, Anna Mae was a Rosie the Riveter, working on fighter planes.
But that was just the start for her. After that, she liked business and she stayed in the business world.
In 1950, the hardworking couple used their savings to buy a Dairy Queen franchise.
The center of the town was the Dairy Queen, and everyone went there for date night.
Miss Ann, as a boss, was a demanding person, but she also made you feel like you were part of the family there.
They literally became multimillionaires through this Dairy Queen.
When Ann's husband, Carol, died in 1994, Ann was ready to take on a new business challenge.
She would get these older houses, and then she would make them fabulous, and then she would rent them.
Anna Mae was one of the most successful business people that I've ever known, even in her older age.
Ann was generous with her renters, and she was generous with her family. And everyone knew that they could borrow money from Ann, but they would have to pay it back.
Anna Mae was so much of a businesswoman that she kept a ledger with information about people that owed her money.
In her later years, family and business weren't the only things in Ann's life. Several months before her death, Ann had met retired eye surgeon Dr. Bob Fenneman.
Dr. Bob lived in Evansville, Indiana, about 50 miles from Madisonville. When she and Dr. Bob first started dating, she said, "Well, I've got a boyfriend." The very last thing that Anna Mae acted like was an old lady. When I found out that she was murdered, that just totally shocked me.
At the crime scene, detectives examined the rest of the house for clues.
There were no signs of forced entry into her residence.
Nothing was ransacked, like somebody was searching for something. We didn't have any idea who had committed such a violent act on an 85-year-old woman.
What kind of animal is this person?
While forensics continue their work, detectives speak to the two men who alerted police, her fiancé Bob and her brother Earl.
Earl was asked to establish a timeline for that Sunday, and he had provided an alibi where he was with family at the time of the murder, and the family did substantiate his whereabouts.
What about Ann's fiancé? Could he have had a reason to harm her?
A homicide of this magnitude, you need to ask who's in a relationship with this victim. When we interviewed Dr. Bob Fenneman, he was emotionally distraught.
Dr. Bob did ask Ann to marry him. She did accept his 3-carat diamond ring, but she had not set a date. They had talked about whether they would have some sort of agreement because she did have a lot of money, but she was kind of hesitant.
Police want to know, had Ann's hesitancy about Bob caused him to turn against her in a violent rage?
This person was so enraged that they just kept stabbing and kept stabbing and kept stabbing to inflict that many injuries. This was a personal crime.
Coming up, buried secrets are brought to light.
We all thought he was a family man, thought he was a churchgoer.
She explained that her alibi had been coerced.
While detectives unearth suspects with violent pasts.
He had several assaults in his past.
We're starting to think, hey, this could be our guy.
They had already stabbed another woman. We would never have dreamed who the killer was.
Detectives are investigating the horrific murder of elderly millionaire Ann Branson. Forensics suggests it was a crime of passion.
Dr. Bob, even with his age, we did feel could be a viable suspect.
Dr. Bob was from Evansville, and he drove all the time to Madisonville to court Ann. But she had not yet decided whether she was going to get married.
Had Ann's reluctance turned Bob against her?
Dr. Bob Finneman was asked to establish a timeline and provide us with an alibi.
The day before Miss Branson was murdered, she had gone to Evansville, Indiana, to meet up with Dr. Finneman to go to a dance. And after the dance, Miss Branson returned to Madisonville.
Sunday, he said he attempted to call her and she didn't answer the phone.
It was shortly before 10 o'clock that evening, and Dr. Finneman said that he presumed that she had gone out or that she had gone to bed early.
So the next day, he said he became worried, and he said that's when they discovered the body at the bottom of the staircase.
Detectives learned from speaking to her family that Ann had been to an evening church service on Sunday.
Miss Branson's estimated time of death was on that Sunday evening after she returned home from church. Dr. Bob said that he was at home in Evansville, Indiana.
Taking no chances, investigators search his phone records.
Phone calls placed Dr. Bob in Evansville, Indiana, so he would not have been in the area during the time frame of the murder. He did not have the opportunity to murder her. It just wasn't feasible for him to have committed the crime.
After clearing Bob as a suspect, they ask if he can think of anyone who would harm his fiancée.
Dr. Bob recalled that her handyman, Wayne Shelton, had borrowed money from Miss Ann in the past, and the amount was more than what a handyman should be borrowing from his employer. Mr. Shelton also owed child support. He was trying to provide the court system a statement that she would guarantee his employment, and Miss Branson did not feel that she could guarantee him employment. So she had concerns over it.
The fact that the maintenance man had a financial relationship with the victim made him a person of interest that we wanted to talk to.
Detectives contact Wayne Shelton and ask him to meet them at Ann's house.
Wayne Shelton came to the crime scene when we were there, and I explained to him the circumstances of what had occurred. He was extremely shaken. He was in disbelief.
Police cut to the chase and ask Wayne where he was on the night Ann was murdered.
His alibi was he was in another county visiting with his daughter during the murder of Ann Branson.
Knowing Wayne's alibi is weak, detectives take him to the station for a polygraph. But there's just one problem.
Wayne Shelton had a heart condition. It was so fragile that it kept him from even being able to take a polygraph.
So the polygraph examiner refused to give Mr. Shelton a polygraph.
Frustrated by this setback, Ann's nephew, Jack Branson, a retired FBI officer, pulls some strings.
Mary and I hired a retired FBI polygrapher, and Wayne Shelton said, yes, I'll be polygraphed.
Jack's polygrapher takes Wayne Shelton carefully through the test questions.
Wayne Shelton passed the polygraph with flying colors. So at that point, we were able to say, okay, he passed the polygraph. He did not do it.
As investigators search for new suspects, news of the savage murder puts the whole town on edge.
This had been a little town where literally people didn't lock their doors. And all of a sudden, everyone was a suspect and everyone was afraid.
The community needed to know if they had something to fear. So it was pressure all the way around to get this crime solved.
As word spreads, police begin to receive tips from the public.
We received a tip that there was a black pickup truck at the residence after 12 at night.
Could the black truck belong to the killer? Investigators ask Ann's family if they know anyone who drives such a vehicle.
We kept hearing about a crazy tenant that drove a black truck.
What detectives learn about Ann's tenant concerns them.
Robert Prince had characteristics of a mentally unstable person.
He would actually call her in the middle of the night and say that he had ghosts up in his attic, and would she please get rid of the ghosts.
Ann always said she was nervous around him, and she didn't like it when he came to the house, and he called her at all hours of the day and night.
Miss Branson had received several complaints from the neighbors asking that she evict Mr. Prince from his apartment, and she didn't want to move him from that location.
The family would say, don't become so involved with him.
Had Ann's attempt to move Robert prompted him to attack her?
If Robert Prince was mentally unstable and became angry at her, could he have caused her death?
Detectives investigating the slaughter of Ann Branson have discovered she had been involved in a dispute with a volatile tenant.
Robert Prince would call Mrs. Branson at all hours, saying crazy things to her, wanting her to come over. They had warned her not to go over there by herself.
Due to his mental instability, he did pose a great concern for us to investigate.
Searching their database, detectives find alarming information about their new suspect.
Robert Prince was found to have had a violent criminal history. He had several assaults in his past, and he could express a lot of anger towards someone else.
Police obtain a warrant to search his home.
What we were looking for is the murder weapon. I'm looking for something that's got an edge on it, but that can snap bones and go completely through the victim's body. And I'm looking for any clothes. There's no way that the perpetrator did this without getting some of the blood on himself. But we weren't able to locate any of the items that would be of interest to us in this case.
Despite the lack of physical evidence, detectives bring Robert Prince into the station for questioning.
When he was taken from his residence and interrogated, he did not want to answer any questions to do with his prior criminal history. And upon initial confrontation with Robert Prince, he was extremely agitated.
As he starts talking, we're picking up on his violent tendencies. We're starting to think, hey, this could be our guy.
Detectives note that Robert's right arm is injured.
Even though he's a man that could inflict this kind of punishment, he can't bend his right arm. And we asked him, so you right-handed or left-handed? He said, I'm right-handed.
Detectives wonder, could Robert have hurt his arm attacking Ann?
He said he was in another state at the estimated time of death for Miss Branson.
Robert Prince gave the alibi that he was with some family in Tennessee and that he had stopped in a convenience store and got some gas and got a soda or something.
With nothing concrete linking Robert to the homicide, police have to let him go, and detectives get to work checking his alibi.
We contact that convenience store, pull surveillance video, and lo and behold, there's Robert Prince on camera.
And in addition to that, prior to Miss Branson's murder, Robert Prince had surgery to his elbow area and his arm, and according to his doctor, if he had inflicted those injuries upon Miss Branson, then all of his staples and his stitches in his arm would no longer be intact. So the alibi and surgical area just ruled him out as a suspect.
Back at square one, detectives are relying on the autopsy to break open new leads.
The autopsy revealed that Mrs. Branson was stabbed about 97 times throughout her body. Her skull was pulverized. She was beaten so badly that a lot of the stab wounds were actually inflicted after she had passed away.
The evidence technician said that we're not talking about just a regular old steak knife. It's something that's very heavy, because the blade is going through her bones, through her organs, and was coming out on the other side.
While the autopsy fails to identify an actual murder weapon, it gives a clear estimate of Ann's time of death.
There was a pot on the stove, which she had baked her supper. She had eaten. We were able to analyze the food in her stomach. And based on the absorption rate principle, the time of death for her was approximately 30 minutes after she got home from church.
It was determined that her time of death was between 7 and 7:30 p.m.
As police continue their search for the killer, Ann's family struggles with her death.
Mary and I walked over to Earl's house to see how he was dealing with the grief. And his son, Russell, took us in to see Earl.
The whole family was in shock, and everyone was just questioning who could have possibly done this.
Earl and Russell, they were both saying, we'll be glad when we found out who did this. And we understood that was exactly how we were feeling.
As the family grieves, Madisonville residents question whether their town really is the best town on earth.
When the town found out that Miss Branson had been murdered, it scared a lot of people, because you would think there's just a serial killer or somebody crazy running around to have done that.
This is Madisonville, Kentucky, coined best town on earth. You cannot have an unsolved murder of one of its most prominent members. It can't happen.
As detectives contemplate their next move, an unexpected tip sends the case in a new direction.
We're day 4 or 5 into this investigation, but we have nothing strong yet. And then we get a phone call.
That was the pivotal turning point.
The caller is a local mine worker named Jeff Hibbs.
Jeff Hibbs has some information about one of Anna Mae's nephews, Russell Winstead.
That phone call basically shocked and rocked our investigation.
Five days after the bloody murder of 85-year-old Ann Branson, police are contacted by a man named Jeff Hibbs, who makes a stunning allegation.
Jeff Hibbs believed that Russell Winstead had some involvement with the murder of his aunt, Anna Mae Branson.
Russell Winstead was known as a coal miner, a hard worker. He had 3 sons. He was married to Terry Winstead. It was known that he and his family attended church regularly.
Jeff claims that Russell has a secret unknown to his family.
Jeff Hibbs told us that Russell Winstead had an extreme gambling addiction.
He also tells detectives that he'd gone gambling with Russell a few nights before Ann's murder.
Russell told Jeff he had gotten a loan from his aunt that he had to repay by Monday morning, and that he had $9,700, and he lost every single penny of that money.
Russell told Jeff that they're all going to know about his gambling addiction because his aunt is going to expose him for borrowing money from her on a regular basis and not paying it back.
Jeff tells police that on Monday, the local headlines grabbed his attention.
Jeff Hibbs reads about this old lady that got murdered in Madisonville.
And he was like, oh my gosh, this is the aunt that Russell had to repay by the first of the week.
Detectives go back to Ann's house to search for evidence.
On our second search, I found a ledger and the large amount of loans that was written down for one nephew. They totaled up almost $100,000. The day before her murder, she had actually written down that he had received $9,700 from her and that he had paid her a check for $12,000.
Detectives believe that Russell had given Ann a check in hopes of winning enough at the casino to cover it. But when the check is nowhere to be found, detectives subpoena his bank records.
Upon the financial investigation, it was determined that Russell was basically shifting money around to cover the loans from his aunt. And the missing check for the $12,000 never cleared the bank.
10 days after the homicide, detectives interview Russell Winstead.
Even when we told him that Miss Branson had put it in her ledger, Russell still denied any knowledge of that check. He denied having any involvement in this whatsoever. At the time of death, Russell explained that he had gone to church and that upon leaving church, he had dropped his children off at his ex-wife's house, and then that he was at home in the basement.
Russell said he got home about 7:25 p.m.
With Ann's time of death estimated between 7 and 7:30 p.m., detectives interview Russell's wife, Terry, to verify his alibi.
Terry's explanation for Russell was down to the minute.
She said, yeah, we went to church. We drove separate. He dropped his son off at his ex-wife's house, and then he got home 7:25.
Russell had a solid alibi. His wife told the exact same story he did as to where Russell was on the night of Mrs. Branson's death.
There's just one loose end for detectives to tie up: Russell's casino visits.
I asked, you know Russell gambles, right? And she's like, yeah, I know he gambles. I was like, on a bad night, what do you think he loses? And she's like, I don't know, 2,000 or 3,000. I was like, try 38,000 on one night. And then she started bawling.
This was just devastating to her because she trusted Russell.
That same day, police get a search warrant for Russell's home.
We didn't find the murder weapon. We didn't find any clothes that were bloodstained. But we did recover a couple of burner cell phones that his wife didn't know even existed.
One of the cell phones was only used to contact a waitress at one of the casinos.
Russell had a girlfriend who worked at the casino.
So we talked to the waitress, and it alarmed us somewhat that even after he's a suspect of interest in a murder case, Russell was still continuing to go to the casino, still trying to be the high roller.
Russell has plenty of secrets, but do money problems and infidelity make him a killer?
Russell's father, Earl, told me the police are trying to jam Russell up because they need a suspect and they want to solve this case.
When we found out that Russell had been living a literal double life, we were shocked. But we felt that there was no way Russell had not done this. We believed it with all of our hearts.
But as they dig deeper into Russell's gambling, detectives find evidence of a man out of control.
We come with a total of 236 times that Russell had visited a casino in the last year, losing hundreds of thousands of dollars in that time frame.
When it's rolled up into one, you're just like going, who is this guy?
The scope of Russell's betrayal prompts his wife, Terry, to kick him out of the house and return to police with a damning admission.
Terry explained that her alibi had been coerced.
She said that Russell is the one that told her what to say.
She explained that Russell actually did not come home around 7:30 p.m., that it was more like 9. So that put him as being a person that could have committed this murder.
Investigators obtain a warrant for Russell's arrest, but when they go to bring him in, they're in for a shock.
Russell Winstead had fled the country. We were very concerned that he would not be brought to justice.
When I found out that Russell Winstead had fled, it was my goal to get him, no matter what the cost, manpower, what it took.
The prime suspect in the murder of Ann Branson is her nephew, Russell Winstead. But before investigators can make an arrest, Russell goes on the run.
For Russell to have fled the country, it was shocking to all of us.
An innocent man doesn't flee like that. This is the last straw, and he has to come back.
I have never been a person that takes waiting very well, and our son came up with the idea of putting this case on America's Most Wanted.
If you've seen Russell Winstead, please call our hotline tonight, 1-800-CRIME-TV.
They aired the show February of 05, and then in May of 05, Russell was spotted at a casino in Costa Rica.
He was living under a pseudonym. He was still bouncing from female to female, and he was living the lifestyle that he attempted to live here.
We knew where he was. We wanted justice.
There's just one problem. With Russell facing a potential death sentence at home, Costa Rican authorities refuse to hand him over.
Costa Rica will not extradite anyone to the United States where the death sentence is a possibility. And also, they have gambling. So Russell had done his homework big time.
While investigators strategize how to get Russell back to Kentucky, they make a troubling discovery.
We found out that Russell's father, Earl, had been providing Russell with monies for his lifestyle in Costa Rica.
We had a guy come forward that said that Earl was actually paying him to wire money via Western Union to Russell in Costa Rica. We believed Earl was actually aiding and abetting Russell's flight.
With Earl sending his son proceeds from the estate of the person he murdered, it basically rubbed salt in the wound. It turned your stomach.
Investigators set up a sting to catch Earl red-handed.
So we wired this guy up as a confidential informant, and he met Earl, wired the money, and we got Earl doing that 2 or 3 times.
It was verified that Earl was sending money to Russell in Costa Rica.
While investigators find no evidence that Earl was involved in his sister Ann's murder, they arrest him for helping his son evade justice.
It really struck all of us by surprise. The thought that Russell Winstead's father, Earl Winstead, was sending money down to live on in Costa Rica just sat like a burr under a saddle with me.
I remember Earl being led out in handcuffs because he was arrested for helping a fugitive. But what really hurt us deeply was the fact that we knew it was Ann's money that was paying for her murderer.
Earl eventually pleads guilty to 7 counts of hindering apprehension.
He was placed on probation for 2 years, and if he contacted Russell at any point during those 2 years, then he would have to serve jail time.
While Earl faces legal trouble at home, federal authorities move in on Russell in Costa Rica.
Russell was observed at the gambling casinos. They felt that that was probably the safest place for them to take him into custody. So as Russell was leaving the gambling casino in Costa Rica, he was apprehended.
He was arrested in May of 2005 in Costa Rica. We did not get him back to Kentucky until February of the following year. Extraditing someone back from another country takes a lot of time, and federal authorities had to make assurances that we would not seek the death penalty against Russell.
It took us 7 months to extradite him back to the United States.
To know that it was taking this long was very hard. In fact, every time we'd visit a cemetery where Emma's buried, I'd say, "We're gonna get him. We're gonna get him." That was a long, slow long, slow process.
Finally, more than 3 years after Ann's murder, Russell Winstead is returned home to face trial for the murder of his aunt.
That day I'll never forget. I went back to Anna Mae's grave and said, "We got him." And I felt like a burden had been lifted, because we knew what justice was going to be done.
Upon Russell's return to Kentucky, we were preparing for a trial when we got another humongous bombshell as far as our investigation is concerned.
Someone who was also charged with murder of an elderly lady came forward saying that he was the one who had killed Mrs. Branson.
All of this evidence has been stacking up against Russell Winstead. And here comes some guy out of the blue telling us that he's the one who committed the murder.
The confession is contained in a letter posted from Hopkins County Jail by an accused murderer named Fred Roulette.
Fred Roulette basically gives detailed information on the murder of Ann Branson that was never publicly made known. He stated that the murder weapon was a Bradis hammer. It is a mining tool, and he advised that he had modified that.
Fred Roulette provided a drawing of Mrs. Branson's home, and it was eerily accurate.
He gives all of these details that only the killer would know. I was like, how could we have gotten this wrong?
Police have arrested Russell Winstead for the brutal murder of his aunt, Ann Branson. But now accused murderer Fred Roulette has confessed to the crime, leaving investigators reeling.
Fred Roulette was also charged with murdering an elderly lady. So you think, oh my gosh, did we get it wrong?
It was completely devastating. So we were determined we were going to find out the circumstances of his confession.
Investigators throw all their resources into checking the validity of Fred's confession.
Fred was a drug addict, and he could not provide the details of the murder and robbery that he himself had committed to the level of detail that he provided about Mrs. Branson's case.
When investigators check the jail records, they discover a telling detail.
Fred did not come forward until after Russell had been extradited back to Kentucky, and Fred Roulette and Russell Winstead were cellmates.
Already facing 25 years on a separate murder charge, Fred Roulette insists to detectives that he killed Ann Branson.
Fred didn't realize until we told him that if he wanted to confess to this murder, it now packed a death penalty. After Fred heard those words, he was like, oh, no, game's off, gig's up.
That's when he told investigators that he had all the intimate details of the murder from Russell Winstead. Fred Roulette was promised that his family would receive compensation since he was going to be in prison for the additional murder. So Fred Roulette agreed to take the false confession.
With Russell's deception exposed, his trial can proceed. In July 2007, 4 years after Ann's murder, a jury hears what really happened on that Sunday night in January 2003.
Mrs. Branson had loaned Russell upwards of $100,000. And Mrs. Branson notated in that ledger was that she had received that $12,000 check from Russell on Saturday as partial repayment of the loan. Russell had a large sum of money that he lost in the casino, and he made mention that He needed to pay back to his aunt on Monday. Russell knew he could not make good on that $12,000 check.
I believe that Russell Winstead was so desperate that he went over and he attempted to talk Miss Ann into tearing up the $12,000 check. When that didn't work, I believe that he lost it and that he snapped.
And that's when she started receiving all the damage to the 65 plus stab wounds to her back. We still do not know to this day how many times Anna Mae Branson was hit in the head.
He cleaned up the crime scene and he felt that he could get away with murder.
Russell Winstead is convicted of murder and first-degree robbery. He is sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 25 years.
We all thought he was a family man, thought he was a churchgoer, but he was leading a secret life when he was off work, gambling. Hid it from the family, hid it from his wife.
We would never have dreamed who the killer was. Of all the people that we could have looked around in a crowded room and said, that's the person, it would not have been the person that ended up being the killer.
When they announced the verdict, relief washed over me like Niagara Falls, a relief that this jury saw through Russell Winstead, and he did not fool them.
Finally, Miss Ann got her justice, and everybody who loved and knew her got a form of justice.
I miss Ann every day. And finally, I can think of her without thinking of her murder. I can finally think of her for who she was. Beautiful, beautiful part of our family.
Anna Mae took pride in who she was. I think she'd be happy to be remembered as someone who enjoyed life and had a good one.
a loving and outgoing mother of 3.
Everybody wanted to be around her and her energy and her beauty.
She was an incredible human being and a great mother.
Is found murdered in a farmer's field.
There was numerous blunt force trauma injuries.
Cuts, lacerations, bruising throughout her body.
This poor woman was brutally attacked and murdered.
As detectives hunt the killer, they unearth dark secrets.
All the information kept leading us to think that he was trying to find a way out of this relationship.
He would throw stuff, break stuff. He was really controlling. He was really manipulative.
They had an argument, something happened, it went too far.
Then, new revelations turn the case on its head.
In the video, there is a male party following her into the darkness.
I had absolutely nothing to do with. What did you have nothing to do with?
And points to a predator no one saw coming.
It was definitely a very big twist.
When the news came out, he made me sick when I saw him. He looked like a monster.
Green Bay, Wisconsin is a relatively small, close-knit community where a lot of people know each other. Obviously, our claim to fame is having the Green Bay Packers in town here. So during football season, pretty much everything centers around that.
It's 100% a place that you would want to raise a family.
The crime rate in the Green Bay area is generally very low, especially when it comes to violent crime.
On a warm May afternoon in 2016, nearby Brown County Sheriff's Office gets a troubling 911 call from a local farmer.
Brown County 911, what's your emergency?
Oh, God. We just found a human body.
Is it a male or a female?
It's got long hair, but I didn't go near it. I'm about at the top of a hill just looking down on it.
The 911 call was from farmers working in a field, and they located a body.
Investigators race to the farmer's field on the outskirts of Green Bay.
The body was behind a brushy, woody area, not visible by the road itself.
It was laying face down with arms spread across the front of her head and feet towards the road. The victim was a blonde female, approximately in her 30s. Past that, we really didn't have any identifying information other than the pink wristband on her wrist. There was a distinct pattern that we found on the victim's back, which appeared to be from the sole of the shoe.
It wasn't until the body was turned that all the injuries were located.
The extent of injuries that she suffered were pretty horrific. There was trauma to her neck that would indicate possible strangulation, in addition to lacerations, bruising throughout her body. Her fingernails were damaged, indicative of defensive wounds. That tells us that she was fighting for her life.
There were nail clippings taken for the potential of any DNA from the suspect underneath her fingernails.
We were looking for anything that could be used as a weapon. However, the search of the area didn't reveal anything.
After questioning the farmer and clearing him of any suspicion, investigators try to determine how the victim ended up in his field.
The area was searched thoroughly for any clothing that may have been left behind, any other tracks, footprints.
There were a set of tire tracks that went from the driveway to where the victim's body was found and then circled back towards the driveway. The farmers work in the field were using a skid steer and a four-wheeler, and they definitely didn't match those pieces of equipment.
We definitely felt like this was likely the suspect vehicle that was used to transport the body there.
As detectives continue to process the crime scene, the local sheriff's office receives another call.
Brown County Public Safety, this is Therese.
How do I go about, with missing person?
Okay, and who's missing?
My girlfriend.
What's her name?
Nicole Vanderheiden.
Our dispatch center received a phone call from a party named Doug Dietrich reporting that he did not know where his girlfriend was. And the last he had seen or heard from her was the night before.
We felt very strongly that the missing person report was going to involve the victim we had in the field.
Officers from the crime scene are dispatched to interview the caller, 34-year-old Doug Dietrich, who lived with his girlfriend, Nicole Vanderheiden.
Is Doug here? Hello. Hi. I'm here for a missing persons report.
As allowed by Wisconsin law, officers secretly film the conversation.
It was important to record the interview with Doug. Based on the victim in the field, it's always in the back of our mind that this could be some kind of domestic violence issue that happened.
Doug looked completely hungover. He had really dark circles under his eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. I asked him why he's making this missing persons report.
Nobody's seen or heard from her since last night, but I'd say midnight.
Okay. Doug indicated that he and Nikki joined a group of friends out at a local establishment to participate in watching a live band.
Doug provides a telling detail when asked what Nikki was wearing.
She would have a bracelet on.
Okay.
It was a pink bracelet for the 21 verification.
There was a wristband that the victim was wearing. So based on that information, we were quite certain that it was Nikki that we were with in the field.
As police work to confirm that the victim in the field is 31-year-old mother of three, Nicole Vanderheiden, they learn more about her background.
Nikki was born in Manitowoc, Wisconsin. Then she went to high school here. She was the most amazing, inspiring, beautiful, happy woman I have ever met in my life. She always enjoyed being around family.
After high school, Nikki attended the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, graduating in 2010.
Nikki's background included a double major in science and education. From that, she was a substitute school teacher.
Nikki was one of the hardest workers I've known. She always had two jobs as a substitute teacher and waitressing.
Outside of work, Nikki was dedicated to fitness.
She definitely took care of herself, and she worked out a lot. Everybody wanted to be around her and her energy and her beauty. We always complimented how beautiful she was, and she was inside and out.
In 2005, Nikki got married and had 2 children, but the marriage ended in 2012.
Nikki was definitely a hands-on mom. I think it made her proud to be able to do that, because being a single mother is not easy.
Then, in 2015, Nikki met Doug Dietrich.
Nikki and Doug had a spark. They moved very quickly and got pregnant, and she was so excited to become a mother of 3 beautiful children. Nikki and Doug were still learning to live with one another. It was definitely a life changer.
As Nikki's boyfriend, Doug is a leading suspect in her murder. He is brought to the sheriff's office for a formal interview and informed that the body police have found is most likely Nikki.
This body that was found down the street, there's a lot of similarities.
Doug was crying, emotional, in a state of shock.
With Nikki identified as the victim, detectives asked Doug to recount the events leading up to the last time he saw her alive.
Doug reported that they had been out at a concert at the Watering Hole, which is a bar in a suburb of Green Bay.
As the night progressed, they had been consuming alcohol, and Doug had ran into some friends from high school that he had not seen in a while. And he confirmed that Nikki was mad because she saw Doug talking to another female at the watering hole, and this basically set her off.
From there, they got separated. He stayed at the watering hole with his friend Greg, and Nikki went with their friend group to the Sardine Can, which is downtown Green Bay.
Doug had last actually seen Nikki around 11:30 when she departed from the watering hole to the Sardine Can.
At some point, Nikki did get a hold of Doug on the phone.
What did she say? Who are you talking to? She was hysterical, drunk, and irrational, not making any sense.
Detectives ask if they can search Doug's phone for any texts he'd exchanged with Nikki.
Nikki was definitely angry texting Doug. She made mention of what bitch are you talking to? She was accusing him of cheating, telling him that he was abusive. It was actually a really big red flag for me.
Had Doug and Nikki's argument escalated into violence later that night?
It started to kind of click with everybody that they had an argument, something happened, it went too far, and Doug may be involved.
Coming up, detectives learn more about the night of the murder.
When we look at the video footage, you can see a male follower out of the gate.
We are trying to figure out what exactly happened a short distance away out of camera view.
She's not wanting to have anything to do with him and starts turning into an argument and becomes a little bit physical.
And uncovers surprising new suspects.
I'm going to tell you that your timeline seems so abundantly rehearsed. The time, to be honest with us, is right now.
Before a stunning twist throws the case into turmoil.
The true killer came completely out of left field.
The Google dashboard data showed him at every single crime scene that we had.
I was very concerned who this could be. Who did this to our beloved Nikki?
After confirming that the body discovered in a farm field is 31-year-old mother of three, Nikki Vanderheiden, police suspect that her violent murder may be linked to an angry exchange of texts she had with her boyfriend Doug Dietrich the night she was killed.
The text messages definitely led us to believe that if Nikki would have made it home, and if she would have had contact with Doug, there would have been some sort of altercation.
When detectives pressed Doug about what happened that night, he claims that after 12:30 a.m., he and his friend Greg left the bar they'd been at to look for Nikki at another bar.
Doug describes getting the Sardine Can with Greg, finding that Nikki's not there, and then continuing to look around for her and being concerned.
Doug stated that he had assumed that Nikki made it home and that she would be there when he got there. So him and Greg got in their car and drove home.
With Nikki's two older children away for the night with their father, Doug says he got home to find the babysitter and his son, but no Nikki.
She said we haven't heard from Nikki, and I was just kind of figuring wherever she went, with friends or whatever. And that's why I just, went to bed. She did not come home at all last night after you? Not at all. There wasn't a blip or word from her.
He said that he woke up to give the baby a bottle at 6:30 in the morning, and Nikki wasn't there.
And it did not appear that Mr. Dietrich was all that concerned until later in the day, which drew our suspicions.
I did have concern as to why did it take until about 4:30 the next day to report her missing.
Following their interview with Doug, investigators obtain a sample of his DNA and release him.
The initial interview with Doug was basically to get him locked in so that we could corroborate everything that he was telling us through either physical evidence or through other statements from other witnesses.
As police set out to verify Doug's story, Nikki's family and friends learned that she's been murdered.
Knowing that Nikki was murdered and how horrific it was impacted our lives in a very horrible way. Who the hell would do this to someone with such an amazing, beautiful soul?
Reports of Nikki's murder spread shock through the community, and Nikki's family members share their grief on local news.
Heather Meyer and her family say it doesn't seem real.
Terrible. Absolutely terrible. She's been extremely up and down. I'm in pain.
As Nikki's loved ones continue reeling from her death, an officer from the sheriff's office makes a crucial find.
An officer located some clothing on the side of the road, approximately a mile drive from where Nikki's body was located. Deputies were able to identify the clothing as Nikki's.
There was blood located at numerous areas in the clothing. The majority of the blood was in her pants area.
There was also a purse located which contained her ID. Her cell phone was also found at that same location. It was pretty apparent that it just got tossed out the window in a panic just by the suspect wanting to get rid of it.
As they submit Nikki's items to the lab for testing, detectives receive her autopsy report.
The primary injuries were the strangulation and trauma to the head.
They had discovered over 240 injuries to Nikki's body, including 30 to her head and face area. The last few minutes of Nikki's life would have been very painful.
There were injuries to her genitalia, which could be indicative of a sexual assault. The medical examiners did do a sexual assault exam, which included swabbing for evidence. The lab started finding a partial male profile, but they didn't have enough information to get an identification of it.
The crime lab advised us that we would need to continue to submit samples that the suspect would have touched. We're only allowed to send in so many exhibits at a time as the crime lab is very busy. We have hundreds of swabbings of Nikki's clothing, so I started off with areas where you would more likely see some touch DNA.
While they await answers from the crime lab, detectives get a hold of security video to learn what they can about Nikki's last hours.
When we first were able to take a look at the video footage from the sardine can, we were able to identify Nikki there with Doug's friends. Initially, she appeared to be having a good time, dancing around.
The later portion of the evening, we can see Nikki and her group of friends at an outside table, and you can see Nikki looking down at her phone. You can tell by her body movements that she is upset.
And eventually, she gets up and storms off through an entrance that they're sitting nearby.
What detectives see next catches their attention.
After Nikki leaves, you can see a male follow her out of the gate.
Police ask themselves, who was this man, and was he involved in Nikki's murder?
We knew that his information was going to be vital. That was the last time Nikki was seen before she was killed.
We wanted to know everything that he saw and heard because he's the last known person that we knew that saw her alive.
The day after Nikki Vanderheiden is found murdered in a farmer's field, investigators are trying to track down the man seen following her out of a bar just hours before she was killed.
In the video, there is a male party following after Nikki and walking off into the darkness. We are trying to figure out what exactly happened a short distance away out of camera view.
Officers are dispatched to interview patrons who were at the bar that night.
Based on the interviews with witnesses, we knew that male was Aaron Kolinsky.
This was a friend that they were with earlier in the night.
Police track Aaron down and bring him in for an interview.
Aaron advised us that throughout most of the night, Nikki was having a great time. And then at some point, he saw a mood shift in her. He basically had said that Nikki was trying to get a hold of Doug and that he wasn't responding.
Nikki ultimately became very angry, and that's when she left the sardine can on foot. Aaron describes following her and trying to convince her to come back and get a taxi or an Uber to go back home.
What Aaron says happened next raises detective suspicion.
But she's not wanting to have anything to do with him, and it starts turning into an argument and becomes a little bit physical.
At one point, Nikki fell to the ground on her own, and she started creating a bigger scene. Aaron advised us that she began kicking and punching at him as he was trying to help her up. He had tried to tell her, "Hey, we can get you home, you can come with us," but she refused.
Aaron noticed that there were people in the neighborhood seeing what was going on, so he decided to just leave it alone at that point.
Investigators wonder if there's more to the story than Aaron's telling them.
We are actually able to find those people, and they indeed remembered a female and male yelling or having a disagreement.
Continuing to watch the video, Aaron does return a very short time later, and based on the other statements from the friends that were with the group, we knew that Aaron didn't necessarily do anything wrong.
Aaron says he and his friends took an Uber home, never to see Nikki alive again.
There was video footage that showed Aaron and the other group leaving in an Uber, and there was no indication that they had come back to the area after they left.
With Aaron crossed off the list, police continue scouring the bar's security video for clues and find something unexpected.
We eventually saw Doug and Greg arrive there. Doug told us they're looking all over for Nikki, but the video is showing that he and Greg go to the bar and just start hanging out. It definitely isn't consistent with the sense of concern that he was initially talking about.
According to the surveillance video, Doug and Greg stayed at that sardine can until about 2:15 in the morning. And the fact that Doug said that they did all this looking while at the sardine can told us that he's not being entirely truthful with his efforts to locate her.
Detectives wonder if Doug had misled them about his concern for Nikki. Was there something he was hiding?
Just the mere fact that he didn't know where his girlfriend was and didn't appear to care all that much was a red flag.
With their suspicion growing, police reach out to Nikki's family to learn more about her relationship with Doug.
Nikki's mother and sister, they both voice concerns of Doug's behavior.
I know. It's really, really rocky during her pregnancy and their relationship. Crazy relationship. He's always been very controlling. I had to ask her to get rated her. Yeah.
Nikki's mom, as well as her sister Heather, both say that they wouldn't be surprised if Doug was the person that was responsible for this.
Investigators search Doug's name in police records and make an alarming discovery.
Checking police records, we did locate past girlfriends that accused him of being abusive. There was at least one incident that was reported to police, but was never charged.
Police contact the woman who filed a complaint against Doug and ask her for more details.
When you would argue, it would be...
He would spit in my face.
Okay.
He would, throw stuff, break stuff. He was really controlling. He was really manipulative.
So when we saw that, that was obviously very concerning to us.
He tackled me and broke my ankle.
Despite learning that Doug's ex-girlfriend had a prior assault conviction and that Doug had never been formally charged for domestic violence, investigators remain suspicious.
At this point, we had the information that showed there could be the pattern of this abusive, aggressive behavior. And we know that Doug and Nicole had a volatile relationship, which would lead us to believe that there would be some sort of confrontation that night.
Police obtain a warrant to search Doug and Nicole's home.
During the search at Doug and Nikki's house, there were several things of concern that were located. There was blood on the floor in the garage. There was blood and dirt found in Nikki's vehicle.
There was also a set of Nike Air Jordan shoes that had a herringbone pattern on them, which was similar to what was on Nikki's back. There was also some red marks on the surface, appeared to be blood on the bottom of those shoes.
While conducting the search, Doug's neighbors from across the street approached police with a startling new discovery.
While mowing their lawn, they noticed a blood spot on the curb line of their property, and also they hit a cord of some type with their lawnmower.
We did find a large quantity of what appeared to be dried blood, as well as 2 pieces of electrical phone charging cord. There was also some clumps of blonde hair.
The blood on those items and the blood found in the road were positively identified as Nikki's. It was pretty apparent to us that that's where the altercation took place. That's where she was likely killed. When that crime scene in front of the house was located, that gave us a theory of what happened, and it continued to point us towards Doug as the suspect.
After determining that Nikki Vanderheiden was likely murdered on the street in front of the home she shared with Doug Dietrich, investigators are weighing a growing body of evidence against Doug.
This evidence that we found is kind of emboldening what we had initially thought, that Nikki got home, an argument ensued between her and Doug, and this incident took place in the street, and somehow some of that evidence would have gotten transformed into the garage and then into Nikki's vehicle.
Looking at the totality of the circumstances, we decided there was probable cause to arrest Doug at that point.
Okay. Right now I'm going to be taking you into custody, be handcuffing you. I'll explain all that to you in a bit, and transporting you down to the sheriff's department. Okay? Okay. Be cooperative with me. All right.
With Doug in custody, detectives work to solidify their case against him.
When we did the search of Nikki's car and found the blood and the dirt in the car, it was initially thought that that may have been the vehicle that was used to take Nikki to the field where she was located.
One of the things that we learned was that she had a progressive snapshot device in her vehicle, which is used for driving behavior, insurance rates. But we figured that this could help us show location from the night she was murdered.
Once we got those records back, it was found that her vehicle did not move the night of her murder. At that point, all kinds of questions are still out there. The big one being if Doug was involved in this, how Doug may have moved her. Did he use a different vehicle? Did he have help?
We knew that Doug's vehicle was not in play. It was at the watering hole all night, where it was verified on video.
One person whose name came up was Greg Matthew, who was actually driving Doug during their night out and dropped Doug off at home.
Greg was Doug's best friend, was with Doug that entire night, and we were focused on him maybe being an accessory.
Investigators bring Greg to the sheriff's office and ask him about the night of the murder.
Greg was very exact about timelines of phone calls and what they did that night.
12:15, got in my car, Nikki was calling him, yelling at him, telling him she's leaving. By the time we get back to the sardine can, all of our friends left. At what point we left, it was probably 2:15. Got to Doug's house probably at 2:45 and went back to my house. My parents were home. They know that I was there the rest of that night.
Greg's timeline was very consistent with Doug's, which was suspicious in nature that you usually aren't going to have your times down that path.
I'm going to tell you that your timeline seems so abundantly rehearsed. So the time, to be honest with us, is right now.
We pressed Greg very hard, hoping that we would find some sort of inconsistencies in his story or get him to crack and finally turn on Doug.
Honestly, I had absolutely nothing to do with what? What did you have nothing to do with? Anything to do with? What did you have nothing to do with? So I would like to leave.
After becoming upset with some questions, he did leave while investigators were still sitting at the interview table talking to him.
Investigators asked Greg's parents to confirm his alibi of coming straight home from Doug's shortly after 2:45 a.m.
Greg's parents told us they were only going off of what he told them. They didn't physically see him or have any firsthand knowledge.
While detectives keep Greg on the board as a potential accomplice to Doug, they receive DNA test results from the crime scene.
There was little to no sign of Doug's DNA anywhere on Nicole's body or clothing.
Doug's DNA profile is not matching up with an unknown male DNA profile that we're finding on those items.
Test results on other evidence bring even more disappointing news for investigators.
It turns out the blood on the floor of the garage was likely from a turkey that Doug had killed while hunting. The blood in Nikki's car was from one of her other children, and it was not Nikki's.
What we thought was blood on the bottom of the shoe tested inconclusive for blood.
So all those things that we thought we believed to be Nikki's blood turned out not to be. We also got location data from Doug and Greg's cell phones that corroborated their account of where they were that night, down to the times they left the bar, the route they took home, then when they got back to Doug's house, and from there.
With no concrete evidence linking Doug to Nikki's murder, authorities release him from jail.
Doug's DNA isn't really showing up where we thought it was going to be, and there's still this unknown male profile that really threw a curve at us.
Police believe that Nikki was murdered in front of her own home. But if Doug hadn't killed her, who had?
I was very concerned who this could be, who this monster could have been that did this to our beloved Nikki.
Two days after finding Nikki Vanderheiden savagely murdered, detectives hunting her killer arrested her boyfriend, Doug Dietrich. But when DNA evidence exonerates Doug, detectives turn their focus to one urgent question.
The biggest question we had to answer outside of who did this was, how did she get home? We spent countless hours watching video surveillance of every single known business between Nikki's residence and the sardine can. We had investigators watching highway camera footage, bridge camera footage to see if we could catch either her walking or crossing the river to get to that side of town.
We were running out of leads. It was frustrating at times.
Still hoping for a DNA match to the killer, investigators continue sending the crime lab samples of Nikki's clothing found at the side of the road.
We picked 10 items at a time for testing. We're looking for any items that we believe might contain more of this unknown male's DNA, hoping for a full profile. After sending several batches and not coming up with anything definitive, we end up sending a batch that included the socks that Nikki was wearing still when her body was found.
The crime lab were able to get enough of a profile off of that sock to be able to enter it into the CODIS system.
The suspect somehow got some touch DNA on those socks.
Entered into the National DNA Database, the profile returns a hit that takes investigators by surprise.
The DNA hit that we received was that of George Stephen Birch, who was from the state of Virginia.
As far as we knew, he had no relation to anybody that was with Nikki that night or Nikki herself. All the information we had was leading us towards Doug. So once we got that DNA information, it was very surprising.
George Birch was in and out of prison on the East Coast, and at some point earlier in 2016 had moved to the Green Bay area.
So we start digging through the Green Bay Police Department records, see what we can find out about him.
George Stephen Birch was contacted by the Green Bay Police Department a few weeks after the homicide for a hit-and-run car accident. The vehicle was a Chevy S10 Blazer that was found a short distance away from where Mr. Birch was staying.
At the time, he was questioned about it and claimed that the vehicle must have been stolen.
Suspicious about the nature and timing of the supposed theft, investigators see if his Chevy Blazer could have been used to dump Nikki's body.
We ended up comparing the specs of a Chevy Blazer and the width of the tire tracks that we found in the field, and we found it to be a very near match.
Digging deeper, detectives find even more evidence connecting George to Nikki's last known movements.
We knew that he hung out at a bar that was down in that same general area of the sardine can.
We were able to identify Birch's Google account and track the location of the cell phone that Google account is associated with.
The Google dashboard data showed us roadmap of Mr. Birch's whereabouts that night, and he was found at every single crime scene that we had, including the farm field, Nicole and Doug's residence, the roadway where Nicole's property was found, and then back at his residence.
When we got that information, we knew we had our guy at that point.
Police track down George Birch and bring him into the sheriff's office.
When we had our contact with Mr. Birch, it was obvious that this wasn't his first contact with law enforcement. He's very cool, very calm. The reason you're here is in reference to a homicide investigation into Nicole Vanderheiden. Okay? So, is this something that you want to talk to me about? Sir, I think we're for a lawyer. Okay.
Birch didn't provide any details or provide his version of events of anything. We still didn't necessarily have the details on how they met, why they were together.
But with DNA and other evidence firmly implicating him, police charged George Birch with Nikki's murder.
When the suspect was arrested, it was a result of actual physical evidence, and I felt so much relief that the family would never have doubt as to who did this to Nikki.
When the news came out about who did this, he made me sick. When I saw him, he looked like a monster.
On February 19th, 2018, George Birch goes on trial for the murder of Nikki Vanderheiden. But when he finally takes the stand, What he says leaves the courtroom stunned.
At trial, Mr. Birch's explanation for what happened was he met Nikki at the bar. They were getting along, flirting, having a good time, and he ended up bringing her back to her house where she resides with Mr. Dietrich.
George said they were having sex in front of Nikki's house in his vehicle, and at some point someone comes out, hits him over the head with a pistol, and knocks him unconscious.
The next thing that I remember was literally waking up on the ground outside the truck.
He wakes up and finds Nikki already dead on the ground and someone holding him at gunpoint.
At that point, did you know who that individual was?
Never seen him before in my life.
Do you know who that individual is now?
Now I do.
Who was it?
It was that Dietrich.
Investigators believe that 31-year-old Nikki Vanderheiden was brutally murdered by convicted felon George Birch. But at trial, George blindsides everyone by claiming that Doug Dietrich was the one responsible for Nikki's death.
Mr. Birch in the courtroom was very arrogant, very pompous. His demeanor was that of, I'm innocent and Doug did this.
Mr. Birch advised us that Doug ordered George to drive the body to the farm field. George said that Doug had ordered him to carry Nikki's body into the field and drop it. George then said that at one point he is able to get into a struggle with Doug, push him away, and get back into the car and take off.
He didn't come up with that story until he had a chance to look at all the evidence that was being filed against him.
George's wild allegation forces detectives to dig deeper to prove his guilt.
Part of the obstacles in this was disproving that Doug did it and show his movements from that morning and that night.
During the investigation, we learned that Nikki had given Doug a Fitbit device as a gift. So we realized that Doug was wearing that Fitbit device during all our contact with him. So we're able to review the information on the Fitbit device when he was home, going to sleep, and waking up again.
Based upon all the Google dashboard data that we had from George, we knew at what time he and Nikki arrived back to Doug and Nicole's residence. So we were able to look at Doug's Fitbit to show that at that time that George and Nicole were outside, Doug was sleeping and not, in fact, out murdering his girlfriend and disposing of the body.
Back in court, prosecutors used the location tracking evidence to demolish George's story.
The act of violence that Doug allegedly did to him did not add up with any of the other evidence that we had.
None of us bought George's story in court. We all knew it was a joke and a fairy tale made up. I think Nikki just wanted to get home to her children, and I know she fought for her life that night.
Now prosecutors put forth their theory of what really happened that night.
What I believe happened is that there was some arguments between Doug and Nikki.
I believe that Nikki did leave the sardine can pretty upset and ended up at Richard Cranium's bar, about a half mile away.
She was intoxicated. She was by herself. She was emotional. She is very outgoing, personable person. So she'd be very easy for someone to prey upon.
At some point, she meets George Birch. They get to talking. He offers Nikki a ride home. She accepts it. They end up in front of her house. I believe at that point, George thought he was going to get some action for taking a girl home and didn't expect her to start fighting.
and that enraged Mr. Birch.
It turns into a sexual assault. At some point, he strangles her with that phone cord that was found.
She fell out of the vehicle. He continued to stomp on her back and her head, eventually killing her. And then loading her up in his vehicle, driving her to a field and disposing of her body, and then going home like nothing happened.
This poor woman was absolutely brutally attacked and murdered in front of her own home where her baby lay sleeping, and the thought of what he did to her is beyond comprehension.
After closing arguments, it didn't take very long at all for them to make a decision.
The verdict reads as follows. We, the jury, find the defendant, George Stephen Birch, guilty of first-degree intentional homicide
For murdering Nikki Vanderheiden, George Birch is sentenced to life in prison without parole.
The true killer in this homicide came completely out of left field. I felt extreme relief for the family that someone was going to answer for this extremely heinous, horrific crime.
He's going to prison for the rest of his life. That was music to our ears. But we still knew it wasn't going to bring our Nikki back.
Nikki had 3 young children at home, one of which is a newborn. She had her entire life ahead of her and a lot of things to accomplish and a lot of friends and family that miss her.
She was an incredible human being, a great mother, and she should be recognized as that.
Despite the pain of Nikki's loss, her friends and loved ones are devoted to keeping her memory alive.
My children and I, we celebrate her life every year on May 21st, and we talk about her, and we go to the cemetery. I love to remember Nikki dancing and smiling and laughing. I loved her laugh. It was so contagious. She was always smiling. I love to remember her that way.